In this lecture, we'll be taking a look at how we manage important ecosystems, important not only for the planet itself and its well-being, but also for our own survival. Our focus will be on floodplain management. Degrading the streams and hydrologic qualities of surface flows, not only in North America, but across the planet, are things that we must be concerned about with regard to our natural habitats and our landscapes. Important to this is the ability for a stream to carry specific particle loads and to support particular kinds of aquatic habitats. An excellent example of the destruction of fish habitats can be found in the American Northwest, where we see the interference that controlled damming has made with salmon runs that are important to the traditional livelihood of Amerindian fishermen living along the Columbia and Snake rivers. When we look at damming in general, as it relates to floodplains and any sort of major watersheds, we realize that the effects, the negative effects that this particular kind of process, and it really is a cultural process, the negative effects that it's having are generally felt downstream. Generally, we will see increases in the volume of stream flow, and those are resulting in things like the channelization of streams, and this can have some major impact on how animals such as aquatic creatures, fish in particular, how they are able to thrive in these environments. And this can even affect us. The flooding of basements throughout the Milwaukee area and the high moisture content of many of the local soils in and around Milwaukee have been a direct result of some of the modifications that have occurred with regard to the watershed associated with both the Menominee River and the Milwaukee River. Today, many municipalities, including Milwaukee itself, are actively breaking down dams and trying to remove some of these channelized segments to allow, in the sense, the watershed to return to its natural system of flow. And so in today's lecture, we'll be taking a closer look at how we manage our ecosystems, both the good and the bad. So what is a floodplain? Well, generally a floodplain is simply a river and any and all flatland that is adjacent to it. We expand this definition for our course because it provides the basis for our analysis of cultural interactions, whether they're historic or prehistoric, and it also gives us a sense of how floodplains have developed over time. So we recognize floodplains really to be natural systems. However, we further recognize that floodplains are directly tied to the nature of things like hydraulic energy that is, again, expressed in local drainage and annual precipitation patterns and how we interact with those local expressions of the hydrologic cycle. What does this all mean? Well, really, there are three qualities that we associate with a floodplain. First, a floodplain is a landform that is geomorphologically defined by the water, nutrients, and the particle load of the associated stream or system of flow. Second, it is a wetland biome that is characterized by things like alpha soils that possess a deep solemn that is also characterized by soil horizons that are less acidic, that are sandy in nature, and have a high degree of soil moisture. However, it should also be noted that these soils generally will lack the ability to retain water on their own. They are highly drainable, and they have very limited abilities to hold soil cations, or these positively charged ions associated with soil nutrients, things like calcium, potassium, magnesium, and iron. So it's a very dynamic soil system that we're looking at. The third and final quality that we would associate with a floodplain environment is that we recognize floodplains to be systematically unstable due to their close relationship with the overflow of local drainage patterns. Many of these seem to vary according to annual rates of precipitation. So you may ask yourself, why should we care about floodplains? Why should these ecosystems be important to us, and why should we manage them? Well, on top of this, floodplains claim the lives and property of countless people globally every year. We recognize them to be nutrient rich, but also highly drained with soils that are in a constant state of change. Well, the thing that makes a floodplain important is that it really, in a sense, gives us the raw material for building civilizations. Even to this day, floodplains give us the nutrients that we need to be able to, in a sense, industrialize agriculture and to support that industrialized process. Carl Wittvogel's hydraulic societies are those early states that he, as a historian, associated with things like the Mesopotamian phenomenon or the rise of the uh, dynasties of Egypt or the rise of civilization in central China and the rise of very complex monarchs and monarchical environments in Southeast Asia and the Sino-Indian Peninsula. As Carl Wittfogel points out, these hydraulic societies were dependent upon the annual cycles of flow and of flooding associated with these large floodplain environments. He calls them hydraulic societies, and he recognizes that they were the first regions throughout predominantly the Old World, but we also find these in the New World as well, to advance the process of urbanization. And they did this in a very ancient period of time. They're recognized as being fully established by 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. And it was the qualities of the floodplain environments that these civilizations developed in that allowed them to accelerate this process that is so important to what we recognize today to be the rise of Western civilization. So floodplains have historically and even prehistorically been important to humanity. How do we manage them? Because the assumption here is that they continue to be very important to our continued prosperity, especially with regard to the growing of food. Well, within the United States, researchers have kept detailed records of stream flows and flood patterns for well over a century. Since the 1940s, there has been an increase in the flooding of land associated with the largest flows or systems of flow within places like North America. Because the collection and concentration of rainfall is important, and really most important, in terms of being a natural contributor to floods and floodplain environments, hydrologists have continued to keep precipitation records and have constructed predictive models of floodplain potential that they refer to as PMPs, or probable maximum precipitation models. We realize that these floodplains are important. We also realize that the dangers associated with a floodplain environment and the system of flow that is adjacent to it are also things that need to be monitored. The most dynamic floods that we have seen in the last century have occurred in North America. So PMPs, or probable maximum precipitation models, become very important resources. They act as predictors for these major drainage systems in places like America and Canada, at least the continental United States and Canada. The monitoring of these drainage basins has been an important predictor for local flooding as well. So given their dynamic nature, how do we build in and around a floodplain environment, and how do we do so all the while managing the system of flow, or the parent system of flow that is directly associated with that floodplain? Well, we create what are referred to as perimeter models. These perimeter models have aided flooding engineers to design against or work with natural flooding patterns. The size and nature of floodplains are then understood over long periods of time. So what they're doing, in a sense, is they're geographically mapping the process of annual ebb and flow within that flow environment. They're looking at periods of high rain and flood activity, and they're juxtaposing that with periods of drought. And they're doing this over long periods of time. And that helps them to, in a sense, track out how that system of drainage is behaving over the long run or over the long term. Today, many residential planning maps and insurance maps situated near local surface runs of water will have projected 50-year and 100-year floodplain demarcation lines. In addition to this, restrictive zoning will also be designed in and around these perimeter maps. Though many of us do not like government regulation when it comes to restrictive zoning in areas that we view as recreational in nature, as we explore these beautiful natural landscapes and the wonderful resources that are available to us, these systems of zoning, as they relate to long-term periods of precipitation and flooding in a floodplain environment and surrounding that floodplain environment, do help, in this case, all of us, to protect that environment from contamination, or what is referred to as eutrophication. Unfortunately, it has been the case that only a minimal physical enforcement of these projections and of these zoning maps have been implemented, resulting in continued flooding of homes, continued loss of life, and continued water contamination. Let's take a close look at a local example, at least local to the American West, with regard to a floodplain environment that is, again, adjacent to a major system of flow. In this case, we'll be taking a look at the Horicon Marsh, located near, of course, Horicon, Wisconsin, and directly associated with the flow of the Rock River. The Horicon wetlands represent an important natural resource, not only in the modern age, but also in the early Euro-American period and even the prehistory of the region. Today, the Horicon Marsh and the surrounding landscape is home to hundreds of mound features that are associated with Native American encampments over centuries. The Horicon Marsh is the largest inland freshwater wetland in the world. Its climate and terrestrial biome are quite unique. They're part of the humid continental subregion of the microthermal climate group. What this means is that for people living in and around the Horicon Marsh, they are used to hot, humid summers, year-round precipitation, and winter droughts. Annual temperatures for the region range from, again, averages above 71 degrees Fahrenheit for the summer, and the colder averages for winter months generally will remain at or below freezing, 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Let me mention a little bit about the wetland conditions themselves. Nearly 12,000 years ago, the retreating ice sheets associated with the Laurentide glacial feature, continental glacial feature, carved out the marsh and deposited its lake, along with the drumlins that surround it. This later period of continental glaciation was known as the Wisconsin period of glaciation. Initially, the wetland was actually a glacial lake Horicon. The glacial lake itself drained away, but the wetland environment remained. And geologists place the wetlands development to be at or around 9,000 years ago. So there was a 2,000-year period of time where there was a transition between a glacial lake, something similar to the Great Lakes that we see today in the American Midwest, and this very large freshwater inland wetland environment. As the lake drained, thick levels of silt and clay sediments were deposited, and a significant layer of post-glacial peat also formed in the region. The soils in and around the marsh are dominated by poorly drained histosols and very well-defined envelopes of mollisal types. Lowland soils in this glacial topography are characterized by solemn, again A and B horizons, that are composed of, on average, over 20% organic matter. The top 40 to 50 centimeters of soil is dominated by thick peat and muck, which makes traversing the marsh without a boat very dangerous. This muck, and in this peat, we see a mixture of diluted clay and organic materials. The organics embedded or mixed into these initial soil horizons, again that 40 to 50 centimeters in overall depth, are usually in some sort of state of decay, In this case, fibrous materials of varying wetland sedges, cattails, and rushes are mixed in and decaying. Now, the Horicon Marsh is at risk because local zones of saturation, in terms of those sections of local soil horizons where they are saturated year round, they are fairly shallow. They're just below the surface. Dark mollisols will dominate the higher elevations, so those closest to terrestrial layers, in this very unique landscape, much of it undulating in nature. As I said before, we'll have that deep, dark, organic rich solemn in local soil profiles, but the solemn itself, another characteristic to keep in mind, is that it's very well defined in terms of its color and texture and content. A horizons are notably dark in color with high degrees of humus, and A and B horizons are well structured and easily discerned as B horizons start to express their higher content of clay and silt particles. So even though you would think that when you look at a profile of soils in a marsh environment, in a floodplain wetland environment as we have here, that it would be very hard to distinguish between soil horizons. In fact, because of the strong and significant amount of organics and soil moisture in the again, higher elevations, those closest to the modern levels. In the A, for example, in a transition to B, you can really see a distinct difference between the A and the B horizon, as is also the case as you go even deeper to the C horizon as well. These soil environments are also important for farming in the area. We have seen a very long history of landfilling and changes with regard to the channelization of the local Rock River, again resulting in a lot of the local marshland being well suited for farming. This has resulted in some problems with regard to how certain aquatic animals are able to thrive in this environment, but the DNR, the Department of Natural Resources, has worked tirelessly to reconstruct significant portions of the marsh, and at the same time they have attempted to maintain a pro-agriculture kind of approach toward zoning in the region. One byproduct of the intrusion of farming, or the impact of farming, on the Horicon Marsh environment has been the spread, the increase in the geographical expanse of mollisols, especially those associated with the higher glacial drumlin environments. And so we have seen a pretty important change in the typology of soils in the region. Even with some of the reconstruction efforts, these mollisols continue to be an increasingly dominant expression in the marsh itself. Well, let's look at now wetlands in particular. We'll still focus on the Horicon Marsh, but let's take a look at them as important ecosystems and what they have to offer. Wetlands globally are an integral part of the hydrologic cycle. The presence of huge volumes of water at or near modern surface levels make wetlands important locations for the evaporation of terrestrial water resources back into the atmosphere itself, at least the atmospheric portion of the hydrologic cycle. The reduction globally of wetlands has meant that this evaporation process has been greatly slowed, slowing significantly from the wetland stands of the post-glacial period sometime between 20 and 10,000 years ago. To give you an idea of the amount of water that was stored in the early post-glacial Horicon Marsh environment, it was estimated that in some locations of the marsh, near the center of the lake's drainage basin, peat levels averaged over 90 feet in their thickness, which means that the amount of soil moisture was probably 10 times what it is today. This means that the impact that this marsh and others like it, freshwater marsh environments, the impact that that would have on moisture levels in the lower atmosphere would be significant. And as we have seen a significant reduction in the amount of moisture being held in these environments, we are seeing a corresponding reduction in the amount of available moisture in that troposphere. So it does have an impact on the life that we associate with the planet. The vegetation of the Horicon Marsh today is dominated by wetland plants, as you would imagine. We see cattail grasses, duckweed, which was very important to early indigenous diets. There are traditional algae blooms that are natural in nature and are important cyclically to the health of the environment. We also see the presence of floodplain forests. So we see a lot of silver maples, including green ash and elm. Natural springs are important to the area, especially the area surrounding the marsh itself. They were important resources for many human communities that came into the region to settle it or to at least mine it for important natural resources. And this takes us really all the way back to the earliest archaeological record for the region. Again, these natural springs being a focal point for communities coming in to be able to not only have fresh water for their own purposes, but this is also an excellent area for being able to hunt and gather and then eventually start some small scale farming, in this case more on a horticultural level. Groundwater in the area, and again given these springs being so prevalent, is at or near the terrestrial surface. Correspondingly, the health of local groundwater is important not only to the wetland ecology itself, but also to local communities that mine that groundwater table for their own survival. Local springs, as I said before, where the groundwater table intersects the land surface. They become physical zones where we find saturated layers of local wetland soils, and we also see again even small ponds and lakes developing around these spring environments. So the contamination of local drinking water by local agriculture is another problem given such a high or shallow, in a sense, water table environment. So just to review again, when we're looking at a wetland environment like we have with the Horicon Marsh, again, very closely associated not only with the Rock River as kind of that adjacent system of flow, but also the larger watershed of the Great Lakes here in the upper portion of the American Midwest, we have a vegetative environment that is quite unique. So as I said before, cattail grasses, duckweed, algae blooms, these are all things that are very, very common to this environment over its kind of annual expression. We also see those floodplain forests, silver maple, green ash, and elm as well. So make sure you've got this in your notes and compare what you're seeing in this wetland environment with other ecosystems that are part of your reading. Given all of this, I have to stress the importance again of floodplains and marshland environments like this in terms of human history and human survival. Middening, or the intentional deposition of material, is a common global cultural phenomenon, and we see it again associated with communities living in and around these kinds of environments. Sometimes middening is the result of just garbage being piled up over time. Other times it is associated with cultural practices, some of them religious, some of them funerary in nature. If you take a look at this image here, you can see an effigy mound, a small circular mound that probably doesn't contain human remains, but is associated with a higher elevation looking down upon the marsh. And again, this photograph was taken looking east or slightly southeast from that common kind of central portion of the Horicon Marsh environment. We see quite a bit of middening associated with freshwater environments that are closely related to marine environments. So if you're to move and look at, in this case, floodplains and associated marshes in and around the northeastern coast of what is today the continental United States, or the eastern seaboard, really throughout the eastern seaboard of the continental United States, you would find similar practices. However, prior to creating earthworks that would be, again, relatable to middening practices. We see marine resources being used to create these kinds of middens, but they're more of kind of garbage piles in these regions. All of these are helpful for us because they help us to reconstruct what the communities were like that were utilizing these freshwater floodplain environments, in this case at or near a marine environment, how they were utilizing them for survival. This is a phenomenon that is not only found in the New World, but we do see this as a phenomenon, middening in this case, and even some of the larger earthwork and monumental projects. We see this expressed in and around floodplain environments in Europe as well. Yizra, which is an important region, and of course there is a site named after this region in the upper Mesopotamian region, expresses very similar kinds of structures as we see in places like Horicon, uh, in this case between the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, though, where we have portions of northwestern Iraq, northeastern Syria, and southeastern Turkey. However, with Yizra, we have an archaeological site that, in this case, is associated correspondingly with the rise of agriculture, cereal crops, a kind of monocrop agriculture. Things like wheat and barley were very early domesticates in this section of the Mesopotamian region. The middening and ultimately the mound building that we see in places like Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, however, at this time and with this kind of agricultural economy supporting it, is more focused on political and religious pursuits. It would be a kind of political and religious architecture, as opposed to, in this case, refuse piles that we saw with regard to wetland environments in and along the eastern seaboard region of the continental United States. In places like Horicon, however, as we move into a later period of its prehistory, as we move into a period known as the woodland period, we do see some of that small scale agriculture, in this case horticultural pursuits that are building upon local wetland seed producing kinds of plant resources. When this begins, we see a similar kind of transition or even move toward, in this case, political and religious expressions in middening and mound building, as opposed to what we saw before. So within these wetland environments, it's important to stress that we're dealing with a natural ecosystem that is not new. It's something that has been important to the development of human communities and ultimately the management of these natural millennia. Resources. These are things that need to be protected and to our survival because they are still important. So as you're taking a look at your readings and looking at how natural ecosystems are being managed today through a variety of processes and how they connect to things like even the greenhouse effect that you've read about earlier in the course, again, realize that these are important considerations for us as we look at not only the landscapes that surround us, but also their physical content and our interaction with those landscapes.